How old are you? 18. So your name, Irina? Angelina. Angelina. Yes. And who are you there with? I am with my 2 sisters. And how old are your sisters? One is 19, the other is 17. Did he attack you with a knife? Yes. And who exactly killed your father with the knife? Me. Before we delve any further into this case, my name's Joshua Miles and I cover true crime cases from across the globe here on my YouTube channel. If that's something that you're interested in, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you can be notified of any new true crime videos that I post. And with that being said, let's delve into the case of the Khachaturian sisters. Mikhail Khachaturian, who was of Armenian descent, was born in approximately 1960 or 1961. His exact date of birth is unknown, reportedly due to privacy protection. Now, while the specific details concerning his childhood and his upbringing are also not extensively documented, the fact that he grew up during the Cold War and considerable political turmoil had lasting effects on his morals and his worldview. Mikhail's 30s took place during the 1990s, which placed him firmly within the tumultuous socio-economic environment of the Russian Federation, immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This period, characterized by unprecedented state weakness and rapid economic transformation, shaped the context in which Mikhail had operated prior to 1997. It had been while Mikhail had been establishing himself in Moscow during the early 1990s when Russia had been undergoing a radical and destabilizing shift, attempting a rapid transition known as, quote, shock therapy to institute both a market economy and democracy simultaneously. This ambitious program, spearheaded by Boris Yeltsin, resulted in severe economic hardship, including high unemployment and declining real wages, leading many citizens to feel a sense of failure and a longing for the structure of the socialist past. Crucially, this period saw the disintegration of central state authority and institutional capacity. The government struggled to implement basic functions necessary for a market economy, such as enforcing law and order, collecting taxes, or guaranteeing property rights. This widespread institutional instability and lack of predictability paved the way for pervasive corruption and criminality. As economic recovery failed to materialize as quickly as had been promised, an atmosphere of lawlessness took hold, and in the shadows, illegal businesses, often closely connected to organized crime syndicates, rapidly expanded, bypassing state regulations and tax obligations, often through the smuggling of goods. And it was within this environment of economic anxiety and social disruption that Mikhail built his professional activities. I know that was a lot to digest, that was a lot to take in. It was a crash course on what was going on in the USSR and in the Soviet Union and all of that, and in Russia. But we're not going to get any further deeper into it than what I just said. But basically, times were tough, and Mikhail turned to take advantage of this through his professional work. And by the 1990s, Mikhail had been involved in quasi-legal activities that mirror the opportunistic environment of the time. He was known for involvement in, quote, petty crimes, and functioned as a specialist intermediary within Moscow, specifically identified in the court records as a district-level fixer. Not really sure what that means, but this role connected him primarily to the transportation and trade sectors. And the nature of these activities suggested a degree of required confrontation, supported by the fact that Mikhail frequently carried a firearm and was documented as participating in, quote, showdowns between small businessmen. While an individual who would later become close to him observed that his inherent temperament was one of deep aggression, this aspect was generally less obvious in his early adult years, primarily due to the fact that his business activities rarely kept him at home, so no one really noticed. In 1996, Mikhail was looking for ways to expand his business, and he had heard that his neighbour had been running a family vegetable business. And so Mikhail approached Larissa Dunduk at a bus stop with an offer to potentially help her with her vegetable business. Larissa hadn't been alone at the bus stop. Her daughter Aurelia Dunduk had been with her alongside Aurelia's aunt. pregnant. Aurelia Dunduk had been born in Moldova in 1979, and she had actually grown up there. That was before her family had relocated to Moscow in 1993, where her family had started up their vegetable business. As Mikhail and Larissa, Aurelia's mother, continued to talk business, Mikhail offered to take Aurelia home, and Larissa advised her daughter Aurelia to go with Mikhail and accompany him, telling her, quote, "There are 3 of us, and he is alone. Let him take you. He is our neighbour." Mikhail subsequently took Aurelia home, and a relationship and courtship began to emerge between the pair. Now, it must be noted that at the time of their meeting, Mikhail had been 35 years old, and Aurelia had been just 17 years old. Despite this incredibly concerning age gap, and despite the fact that Aurelia had confessed to friends that Mike was, quote, "not my type," their relationship developed quickly, and it hadn't been long before Aurelia became pregnant. As soon as she had found out about the pregnancy, she actually moved in with Mikhail. Despite the fact that Mikhail wanted to marry Aurelia to, quote, "do the right thing," Aurelia's mother, Larissa, was, quote, "sharply against the marriage." Aurelia had felt compelled to marry Mikhail because of the pregnancy, stating candidly, quote, "I did not accept Armenians as a nation, but I had nowhere to go with my stomach." The Russian view of Armenians had become greatly tarnished due to Armenia becoming independent from Russia in 1991. The Russian-Armenian relations of the time is a very long-winded and complicated subject that is largely outside the scope of this video. But generally, at the time, Russians had a very negative view of Armenians due to the independence, among other factors. And it seemed that Aurelia had assimilated into Russian society and had adopted this same view towards Armenians, of which Mikhail was of descent. Mikhail actually played quite a big role within the local Armenian society within Moscow, so he wasn't shy of the fact that he was Armenian. Though, as she had stated, she felt that she had no other options besides marrying Mikhail due to the pregnancy, and so Aurelia married Mikhail, quote, "with tears in my eyes." And tragically, the violence towards Aurelia had begun before the formal union, with Aurelia recounting, quote, "he beat me, and after that, we went to get married." The physical violence had begun when Aurelia had been 19 years old and pregnant with the couple's first child, and Aurelia would later characterize her marriage to Mikhail as a cycle of abuse. Aurelia accepted the violence, though, initially hoping that his jealousy would subside, quote, "I thought that he was so jealous at first, and then he would calm down." She believed that she could not get out of the situation due to the fear of social shame if she had left the man that she was living with, accepting the violence as the, quote, "will of a man." Quote, "I could not resist. I did not dare to run away, and I was afraid of shame. If you live with a man, you can't just leave." Aurelia and Mikhail would welcome their firstborn child, Sergei, in around 1997 or 1998, and it wasn't long before Aurelia would find herself pregnant again. In fact, Aurelia would give birth to 3 more children, all daughters, all born 1 year apart. The eldest sister, Christina, is estimated to have been born around 1998 or 1999, with the middle sister, Angelina, being born around 1999 or the year 2000, and the youngest sister, Maria, estimated to be born in around the year 2000 or 2001. And during this time of the family's growth, Mikhail initially expressed a reluctance towards having daughters, stating that he did not want girls in the family, quote, "on principle," and Aurelia had worried that he would kick her out after each birth of a daughter, though Mikhail eventually, quote, put up with it calmly. The young family had lived together in one room of a 2-room apartment. So Mikhail, Aurelia, and their children all lived in one room, with them sharing the apartment with Mikhail's relatives, his mother Lida, his sister Marina, and his nephew Arsen. And these relatives contributed to the abusive atmosphere, asserting that it was a woman's duty to endure the beatings, especially since Mikhail was the provider who brings money into the house, and suggesting that the abuse had been Aurelia's own fault. Aurelia felt that she was treated, quote, "like a maid with no feelings or rights," and the cycle of abuse only escalated. Mikhail frequently subjected Aurelia to verbal and physical abuse, yelling obscenities and beating her, quote, "bloody." He sometimes used weapons, even stabbing her on one occasion, and regularly beat her with a baseball bat. On one occasion, Aurelia was forced out of a moving car, an assault that actually led to her being hospitalized. Mikhail retrieved her from the clinic the following day and basically received no questioning about it. Despite the brutality, he would immediately command her to serve him. Mikhail was controlling, forbidding Aurelia to leave the house, and Aurelia was even afraid to discuss her health or, quote, women's problems with him due to the fact that Mikhail disliked complaints. In the early 2000s, Mikhail sustained a serious wound during a confrontation with some of the other businessmen. This injury prompted Mikhail to adopt what was referred to as a restricted domestic environment, which confined him largely to his home. Aurelia noticed that while his cruelty was constant, it became, quote, more and more noticeable after he began to spend all of his time at home. And it was around this same time that Mikhail began to suffer from physical ailments, including encephalopathy and peptic ulcers, along with sleep disturbances, fatigue, and heaviness in the head. Mikhail regularly took clonazepam tablets, which is a powerful tranquilizer prescribed for epilepsy and panic attack, taking them at night for several years, which may have exasperated his sudden mood swings and depressive states. Despite his lack of a conventional job, Mikhail received a considerable monthly income of about 300,000 rubles, which is approximately $3,750 from an investment in a USA-based warehouse business that was established in the 2000s, though he strictly limited the family's allowance for necessities to 40,000 rubles per month, which is about $500. His lifelong negative personality traits, including pronounced egocentrism, heightened suspicion, authoritarian control, and manipulative behavior, grew stronger during these years, and the violence expanded to include the children, starting with when Sergei, their firstborn child and only son, began going to school. Mikhail frequently humiliated and beat Sergei severely, claiming that he did so for, quote, educational purposes to raise a fighting man. Sergei grew up withdrawn and distrustful. Ultimately, Mikhail kicked Sergei out of the house after he'd completed the 8th grade, and Sergei subsequently lived, quote, with friends and relatives, sometimes even in the entryways of apartments. And Mikhail forbade him from coming home, promising to shoot him, quote, when they met. The daughters, Christina, Angelina, and Maria, grew up under conditions described later by Mikhail himself as slavery. He implemented a system of total control in the apartment, installing a video surveillance system and rarely letting the girls out of his sight. Mikhail forced them to be available at his, quote, first call. He maintained a special metal bell by his armchair, and when he rang it, one of the girls had to run immediately to him, day or night, to perform any task he demanded, such as bringing him water or food. He could not even make the effort to open a window by himself. And before you say yes, he sustained an injury, he wasn't physically disabled by it in that way. So he could still perform all these actions. In fact, there's loads of footage of him out and about living his best life, including this video of him with a gun and a horse moving about. This was all about controlling the sisters for him. It was all about controlling his daughters. And the sisters were only permitted to sleep and eat with Mikhail's permission. In 2015, Mikhail kicked Aurelia, his wife, out of the house when the eldest daughter, Christina, had turned 16 years old. Quote, then I left only because I was afraid for my daughters. He put a gun to my face and said, either you leave or I'll shoot you and the children. I consulted with the girls and they agreed. Mum, it's better for you to leave. According to friends of the sisters, their father had already been beating them. The girls had shown their close friends the bruises and said that he beat them for any offense, with his hands, with their head against the doorframe, with the handle of a gun. At the same time, the sisters did not talk about the violence that their mother endured. One of their friends emphasized, quote, she protected them and they protected her. Mikhail began to harass the daughters further soon after his wife left, and clinical assessments that later took place identified a sexual attraction disorder of a pedophilic nature in Mikhail. Initially, he tormented the older girls, Angelina and Christina, separately, hoping to prevent them from realizing and discussing their shared problem. Mikhail forced his own daughters to perform sexual acts, using euphemisms like calling masturbation a, quote, healthy massage, and telling one girl to, quote, take your mother's place, and that he would marry her and she would, quote, bear me a child. Mikhail harassed Angelina, the eldest daughter, most often, particularly after after 2015 due to her perceived, quote, calm nature and patience. And later medical examinations confirms that Angelina had sustained injuries due to sexual violence. The youngest daughter, Maria, was largely untouched by the sexual advances, possibly due to Mikhail fearing that she would tell her mother. In 2016, while on a vacation in Sochi, Mikhail forced one of the daughters to perform oral sex. Following this incident, Christina attempted suicide by swallowing Mikhail's sleeping pills and had to be revived in intensive care. Christina perceived these sexual actions as immoral, knowing that sexual relations between parent and child is incestuous and illegal. A later investigation would establish that Mikhail engaged in violent sexual acts, sexual coercion, torture, and even distribution of pornographic material involving his daughters. All the girls would later be diagnosed with severe mental illnesses as a result of the trauma, including abuse syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder, with Maria being diagnosed with an acute stress reaction. Christina, the eldest, suffered more frequent and severe beatings than her sisters, and she actually developed asthma as a result of the psychological pressure. And later, psychological examinations determined that the girls were in a state of, quote, complete material and moral dependence against a lack of external support, leading them to view their situation as hopeless. In 2017, the Russian parliament overwhelmingly approved a bill that became known as the slapping law. This legislation decriminalized the first offense of domestic violence that does not seriously injure the person, reclassifying it as a minor administrative offense rather than a crime. This policy shift was reportedly driven by pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church and defenders of, quote, traditional values. The ultra-conservative MP Yelena Mizulina, a key figure in the campaign, asserted that husbands should not be labelled criminals, quote, for a slap. The result of this law was severe weakening of legal protections for victims. Critics argued that the state was sending a, quote, very clear message to abusers. Since the penalty for such an offence was typically just a small administrative fine, an average of 5,000 rubles, the equivalent of 2 parking offences, abusers were essentially enabled to return home and continue their behaviour with impunity. This lack of legal recourse is critical to understanding the later events of this case, as the sisters had been living in a system that offered virtually, quote, no single legal mechanism for protection from violence. Experts and defence lawyers argue that in the absence of adequate protective mechanisms, victims are often left with the impossible choice between enduring violence or attempting to defend themselves, resulting in prison. It was in February of 2017 that Angelina and Maria began to be chronically absent from school. The two younger sisters had actually been in the same grade together, as Angelina had started school later, and according to the sisters, Maria would only go to school 7 times in the preceding year. This meant that over the course of the 2017 school year and into the spring of 2018, the girls incurred significant academic debt. When Mikhail or the girls would be asked about these frequent and repeated absences, the school was told that it was due to the, quote, girls' illnesses and the father's illness. The school did attempt to intervene formally. Sergei Koryshev, the director of Moscow School number 1370, noted that after the systematic absences started in February of 2017, the school repeatedly contacted the Juvenile Affairs Commission and the Guardianship and Trusteeship authorities. And by April of 2018, a meeting was held with Mikhail in the presence of a Juvenile Affairs inspector. During this meeting, the father was explicitly informed of his daughter's academic debt and told that, quote, the girls were not allowed to take the state final assessment. Sergei Koryshev reported that the teachers, quote, once again encountered a complete lack of understanding on the part of the father about the need for girls to receive an education. Despite the evident problems, the school staff did not report noticing signs of physical or, quote, moral violence. The principal noted that the girls were perceived as, quote, always open to communication, in a good mood, actively communicated with other students, and were well and neatly dressed. They reportedly never approached teachers with information about domestic violence, and this lack of external distress just showed how effective Mikhail's isolation and control of the girls had been. It must also be noted that, as mentioned, Mikhail limited the family's budget for necessities to only 40,000 rubles per month, forcing his daughters to manage this meagre allowance for groceries, utility, and phone bills. And by 2018, Mikhail had practically stopped letting the young women out out of the house, allowing them only to go to school and to the store. The girls were forced to live under constant threats and bullying, which happened with weapons, of which Mikhail had a cache of at home, including a knife, a hammer, a crossbow, rifles and pistols. Neighbours to the family frequently heard screams and quarrels, but generally preferred not to interfere, treating the violence as a, quote, family matter. Law enforcement and guardianship authorities failed to intervene despite numerous complaints from Aurelia and appeals from the school principal. Mikhail was able to evade accountability by boasting of connections with local police chiefs who allegedly passed complaints directly to him. Aurelia would later state, quote, "In the mid-2000s, I wrote a statement against him, left it with the staff, and the next day he brought it home and tore it up in front of my face." In a written response received from the main directorate of the Minister of Internal Affairs for Moscow, the police avoided the question about the fate of the statements that had been submitted to the Altuvevsky Police Department. But they reported that, quote, "When checking the messages to the O2 service," which is like their emergency police service, "it was established that no messages or statements about Mikhail's illegal actions were received." It must be noted that guardianship authorities did attempt to visit Mikhail's home to check on the girls' situation, but when they attempted to visit, Mikhail simply, quote, "did not open the door for them," and no further attempts were allegedly made. In April of 2018, Mikhail had been away from the family home, and the girls decided to secretly invite their older brother Sergei, who was at that point 21 years old, and as we had discussed before, had been kicked out of the house, and they'd invited him to come visit them. Sergei had brought with him a friend, and they hung out with the younger sisters at the family's apartment. Though, when a relative saw all 5 of them in the apartment, this relative immediately told Mikhail, and he was enraged by this, quote, violation of his control. Mikhail subsequently sent numerous audio messages to the girls, and these recordings contained extreme threats, including promises of violence and rape. Specific quotes from the recordings directed at his daughters include, quote, "I will beat you up for everything. I will kill you." Mikhail accused his daughters of promiscuity, proclaiming, quote, "You are whores, you will die as whores." From what I understand, Mikhail accused his daughters of having intimate relations with the friend of their older brother Sergei that he had brought over with them. Mikhail explicitly threatened to rape them, saying, quote, "I'll publicly rape you in a group, and that they will be incessantly, got it, Angelina?" if they did not leave. This just demonstrated the atmosphere of violence, threats, and sexual abuse that began to drive the girls to despair. And this systematic abuse reached its final intolerable limit on the evening of Friday the 27th of July, 2018. On the morning of the 27th of July 2018, Mikhail returned to his apartment on Altuvevsky Shaush after being released from medical treatment at the Solovyv Scientific and Practical Psychoneurological Center. While he had been at the clinic for what his family's called nerves, later psychiatric exams found he actually suffered from a mixed personality disorder. This condition meant that he was incredibly self-centered, highly suspicious, and had a, quote, pronounced desire to dominate everybody around him. At 7 a.m. on that fateful July 27th, Mikhail woke up his 3 daughters, Christina, who had been 19 years old at that point, Angelina, who had been 18, and Maria, who had been 17, to begin a process that he called a, quote, debriefing. He began scolding and yelling at them because he felt that they had not unpacked his bags properly, and because the house was apparently a mess. His definition of a mess included finding a few black hairs on the floor. The girls had already been living in a state of constant fear because they had spent 14,000 extra rubles from the family bank card during his absence. That morning, Mikhail decided to punish his daughters with what would later be described as a, quote, sadistic execution. He rang the bell to summon the sisters and called each daughter into his room one by one and sprayed pepper spray or tear gas directly into their faces. Christina, the eldest, was the most affected by this assault as she suffered from asthma. The large dose of gas caused her to have an asthma attack and she actually collapsed unconscious. While Christina was passed out, her father slapped her on the cheeks, carried her to the bathroom, quote, undressed her, poured water on her, and performed other immoral acts. The extreme violence directed at their sister made Angelina and Maria feel that their situation had become, quote, subjectively hopeless. They had no faith in law enforcement due to Mikhail's deep ties to the local police. They believed that if they tried to run, he would find them and it would be the end. That evening, while Mikhail sat in his favourite cream armchair and, quote, dozed off or fell asleep, Angelina and Maria decided that killing him was the, quote, only way to stop the hell they were living in. They felt like hostages who were facing regular and inevitable bullying that would only end if they fought back while he was vulnerable. The sisters went to their father's car and retrieved a hunting knife technique that they were familiar with. Mikhail had previously used the same knife to wound their mother, and often held the blade to the girls themselves in order to terrify them. They assigned themselves weapons and roles. Angelina took a hammer, and Maria took the knife. While Mikhail had still been asleep in the armchair, Maria and Angelina began their attack, striking him in the neck and head with the weapons. Mikhail quickly jumped up and began waving them off to fight back. Christina, hearing the screams and noise, ran into the room and saw the bloody scene. She grabbed a pepper spray that had been lying on the table and sprayed it in her father's direction to protect her sisters. However, medical experts later found that Mikhail had no gas in his lungs or eyes, meaning that Christina's action was likely spontaneous and not a premeditated part of the plan to disorient him. Mikhail continued to resist and tried to take the knife from Maria. He was barely standing on his feet by that point as he managed to break free and flee from the apartment, running onto the stairwell outside. Angelina caught up with him on the landing, snatched the knife from Maria, and delivered a single blow directly to the heart. Mikhail, their father, fell and died on the spot in the hallway. He had sustained a dozen hammer blows and 36 stab wounds to his neck, chest, and heart. Experts would later count 45 wounds in total on his body. As Mikhail lay dead, the three sisters entered a state of shock. They were later described that they all felt, quote, hardly conscious of what they had done. And in a desperate and panicked attempt to protect themselves from the law, they tried to make the apartment look like a scene of active self-defense. Maria took the hunting knife and began to inflict wounds on the sisters. They wanted to provide physical proof that their father had attacked them first. As a result of this staging, Maria ended up with a bad cut on her wrist, and Christina was later found with a stab wound to the thigh and various bruises. The sisters were later very honest about this, telling human rights activists about their attempt at staging the incident once they were safely in a detention centre. The sisters were the ones who eventually contacted the authorities, with reports indicating that Angelina had called both the emergency police line and the ambulance to the building, and we did actually listen to that at the start of this video, a clip from the 911, well not 911, a clip from that emergency services call. On that Friday evening, the police arrived at 56 Altovevsky House to find Mikhail's body lying in the stairwell of the building. The man had bled to death from multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest. When the investigators entered the family's third-floor apartment, they discovered what they described as a weapons depot. They seized a massive collection of items that Mikhail had used to maintain his total paternal control. This included a crossbow, 16 darts, a pistol, a Nagant signal revolver, a hunting knife, and 16 cartridges. They also found the baseball bat and various knives that the sisters said he used to beat them or point at their faces for any small offence. The three sisters, Christina, Angelina, and Maria, were officially detained the following day on the 28th of July 2018. During their very first interrogation, the girls immediately admitted their guilt. They were open with investigators, explaining that they had, quote, developed personal hostile relations with their father because of the moral suffering he had caused them over a long period of time. They described a life where they were used as slaves and forced to follow strange rules, such as never saying certain words like salt or pain. Despite this confession, the sisters later reported to the Moscow Public Monitoring Commission that the police had violated their rights during the arrest process. They claimed the officers did not explain to them their rights under Article 51 of the Constitution, which gives a person a right not to testify against themselves. The girls also alleged they were not given the opportunity to make one phone call, and that their first, most important testimony was taken in the absence of lawyers. At this early stage, none of the sisters had their own legal representation and were only assigned lawyers by the court. 2 days after the arrest, on Monday the 30th of July 2018, the three sisters attended a hearing at Moscow's Ostankino District Court. This hearing served as a critical procedural turning point where the government decided to significantly increase the legal pressure on 19-year-old Christina, 18-year-old Angelina, and 17-year-old Maria. Although the sisters were supposed to receive a definitive, quote, preventative measure or a decision on their long-term jailing that day, the court instead chose to extend their temporary detention by another 72 hours. This allowed investigators more time to build their case. One of the most impactful developments during this hearing was that the investigation officially toughened the charges against the girls. Initially, the criminal case had been opened under the standard article for murder without aggravating circumstances, which typically carries a prison sentence of 6 to 15 years. However, during the July 30th proceedings, the classification was upgraded to the much more severe Article 105.2 of the Russian Criminal Code, which defines the crime as a murder, quote, committed by a group of persons a group of persons by previous consort, or an organised group. This specific legal shift was devastating for the sisters' defence because it meant that the older daughters could be facing 8 to 20 years in prison or even up to life imprisonment if convicted. Even as a minor, Maria faced up to 10 years under this new classification. On Thursday, the 2nd of August 2018, the sisters returned to the Ostankino District Court for a formal remand hearing. A formal decision must be made on whether they would stay in jail during the investigation. Now, it's important to note that the court chose to keep the hearing closed to the press, meaning that press and journalists were not allowed inside the courtroom to hear the arguments. According to the court press secretary, Anna Sullivan-Nova, this decision was made because Maria was still a minor and because the, quote, examination of the case materials could lead to the disclosure of information that would degrade their honour and dignity. The case material she's talking about being the evidence of the horrific moral suffering and sexual abuse that the girls had endured for years, which the defence was beginning to highlight to justify their actions. During the hearing, a spokesperson for the court revealed the specific narrative the investigators were piecing together to justify the conspiracy charge. The prosecution argued that the girls had taken concerted action and had planned the attack on their father in advance. They alleged that the sisters had specifically, quote, divided the roles between themselves, while their father, Mikhail, had been vulnerable. According to the prosecution's theory presented at this stage, the sisters waited until Mikhail fell asleep in his armchair before launching a three-pronged assault. They claimed 17-year-old Maria was responsible for stabbing her father at least 35 times in the neck and body, while 18-year-old Angelina used a hammer to smash his skull or strike him at least 10 times in the head. The investigators further alleged that the eldest, Christina, was prepared to spray the contents of a pepper spray in his face to disorient him in space and make it impossible to resist. The defense lawyers, including Alexei Liptser and Yaroslav Pakulin, used this time to begin pushing back against the idea of a premeditated conspiracy. They argued that the sisters were the real victims of brutal violence and that the killing was a spontaneous reaction to a life of continuous hell. They pointed out that on the very morning of the murder, Mikhail had subjected the girls to a sadistic execution by spraying tear gas into their faces, which had caused Christina to collapse unconscious. The defense insisted that the girls acted out of necessary self-defense because they lived in a state of subjective hopelessness where they believed no one, including the police, would ever help them. Despite these arguments, the court's decision to toughen the charges and keep the girls in custody signalled that the state intended to treat the case as a calculated, violent crime rather than a desperate act of survival. During this hearing, the judge ordered all three sisters to be remanded in custody for 2 months until the 28th of September. They were sent to SIZO 6, SIZO 6, which is a women's pretrial detention centre in Moscow. Once the sisters were moved to the detention facility, they were placed in different cells and forbidden from communicating with each other. The psychological state of the girls was described as, quote, fragile and nervous. The youngest sister, Maria, was in a deep state of shock and spent her first days in tears, crying and remembering her mother. Maria complained of frequent insomnia and severe headaches caused by her father previously hitting her in the head, and she told visitors that her dead father continued to come to visit her in her dreams and threaten her. Christina was in such poor physical condition from her leg injury that she had been unable to get out of bed during the initial days of her detention. On the 6th of August 2018, the investigation took a significant step up the ladder of the Russian legal system. The case was transferred to the Central Office of the Investigative Committee. This move meant that high-ranking investigators, led by Colonel of Justice Alexei Standnikov, would now handle the file. Standnikov was known as one of the best investigators in Russia, having previously solved the high-profile GTA gang murders. The defense team saw this as a sign of hope. They believed that more experienced investigators would see that the girls were victims of brutal violence and cynical impunity rather than cold-blooded killers. On the 7th of August, the lawyers officially appealed the arrest of the three sisters, arguing that they should not be in jail at all. And in the middle of August 2018, the evidence of Mikhail's crimes was becoming impossible for the state to ignore. The investigation officially recognised Mikhail's immoral actions towards his daughters, and this was a major victory for the sisters because it confirms the fact of psychological and sexual abuse. On the 20th of August 2018, approximately 3 weeks after the sisters' arrests, the lead investigator officially granted what is known as victim status to Genedik Muselian, Under the Russian legal framework, when a person dies as a result of a crime, their legal rights are transferred to a representative, typically a close relative, who can then participate in the investigation and court proceedings. Yaroslav Pakilin, the lawyer for the youngest sister Maria, noted that the investigator chose Gennady Musalyan because he was the, quote, most active citizen amongst Mikhail's relatives who stepped forward to claim a stake in the case. Gennady Musalyan was not a blood relative, but was the husband of Mikhail's sister Nera. This appointment gave him the power to review case materials, file motions, and officially oppose the defense's version of events. Following his legal recognition, Gennady Musalyan and Naira launched a robust defense of Mikhail's reputation across Russian federal television channels and media outlets. Their primary argument was that the sisters were, quote, demonizing their father to justify the murder. The relatives, along with other, quote, supporters of ultra-patriarchal families, argued that the stories of horrific sexual and physical abuse were fabricated or exaggerated by the defense team to secure an acquittal. The victim's representative, lawyer Georgy Chugashvili, stated that while Mikhail might have been a strict father or even a tyrant by modern standards, the claims of violence were all fiction for protection. Naira and Gennady portrayed Mikhail as a devout religious man who was a respected leader in the Armenian diaspora and a generous provider who showered his daughters with clothes and expensive gadgets. They argued that the girls were, quote, ungrateful, and that Mikhail was simply trying to educate them or keep them from what he perceived as an immoral lifestyle. One of the most serious accusations levelled by Gennady and Naira was that the sisters had, quote, mercenary motives for the killing. This claim suggested that the girls murdered their father not to escape abuse, but to gain control over his wealth and property. This was based on the fact that Mikhail received a sizable monthly income of over approximately 300,000 rubles from his overseas warehouse investments. However, the defense strongly refuted this by pointing out that all three sisters had officially refused the inheritance and wanted absolutely nothing to do with their father's assets or his relatives. Despite this legal refusal, the relatives continue to push the narrative of greed in the media to turn public opinion against the sisters. In early September of 2018, the three sisters went to the Skurbsky State Scientific Center for Social and Forensic Psychiatry for comprehensive mental evaluations. These examinations were vital for the court to understand the girls' state of mind during the killing and to determine if they could be held legally responsible for their actions. The results created a major split in how the justice system would treat the three sisters moving forward. The youngest sister, Maria, who was 17 years old at the time of the murder, underwent tests that revealed a deep level of psychological trauma. Psychiatrists officially determined that she had been, quote, insane at the time of the crime, which is a legal status that means she was, quote, unaware of her actions when her father was killed. Doctors described Maria as being completely uninitiative and passive, a state of mind that they linked to a general state of depression that she developed while living under her father's constant abuse. During her time at the psychiatric hospital, experts noted that while she was, quote, generally quite calm and reasonable, her mental health was extremely fragile. As soon as any conversation turned to her father, she immediately became, quote, hysterical. She also reported that her dead father continued to come to her in her dreams to threaten her even after his passing. Because of this ruling, Maria was moved from a standard detention cell to the psychiatric ward of Butrika prison and was eventually deemed medically unfit to stand trial. Her lawyer, Yaroslav Pakilin, noted that such a diagnosis should eventually exclude the criminality of the act and allow her to avoid traditional prison altogether. The older two sisters, 19-year-old Christina and 18-year-old Angelina, were found to be legally sane, meaning that the state believed that they understood what they were doing. However, the experts' detailed findings painted a picture of two young women who were severely broken by years of continuous hell. They were officially diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and something called battered women syndrome, though some reports specifically use the term battered child syndrome to describe their condition. According to Healthline, quote, battered women syndrome, also known as battered person syndrome, can be the product of long-term domestic abuse. Battered women syndrome is considered a subcategory of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. People living with battered women syndrome may feel helpless. This can cause them to wrongly believe they deserve the abuse and that they can't get away from it. In many cases, this is why people don't report their abuse to police or loved ones. Angelina's state was particularly complex. Experts determined that she acted in a, quote, state of extreme emotional stress. While she was considered sane enough to face trial, psychiatrists classified her specific condition on the day of the murder as, quote, limited sanity. Christina's examination also revealed that she had developed, quote, serious disorders in the area of psychology and sexology as a result of her father's frequent attacks. Doctors emphasized that she would need a lot of time to restore her health and psyche because she remained afraid of everything and often refused to leave her place of residence, even when permitted to by the court. On the 27th of September 2018, Moscow's Basmany court ruled that the 3 young women should be released from pretrial detention. This decision came exactly 2 months after their initial arrest for the killing of their father. The court moved to change their preventative measure from being remanded in custody to a much more unique status known as a, quote, ban on certain actions. This specific legal arrangement is described as being, quote, similar to house arrest, but is considered more lenient. A surprising aspect of this release was that the investigators themselves had actually been the ones to have petitioned the court to let the girls out of jail. They argue that the sisters cannot hide and were no longer in a position to exert pressure on witnesses because every person involved in the case had already been questioned. Furthermore, the defense pointed to the, quote, presence of a mitigating motive as a reason for leniency, stating that, quote, the fact that their father beat them is already an established fact. Despite them being allowed to leave the SIS 06 detention centre, the sisters were placed under extremely rigid and strict conditions. The court ordered that they must live in 3 separate apartments. This meant that one sister stayed at her place of registration, so at the family apartment where Mikhail had died, while the other 2 were placed into rented housing. The rules of their release were strict. They were prohibited from leaving the apartments where they reside from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. They were strictly prohibited from communicating with each other or any other participants in the case without an investigator's permission. The court barred them from, quote, using any means of communication, including telephone or internet, with the sole exception of calling medical assistance, law enforcement officers, or emergency services. The sisters were not allowed to give comments to the media on the merits of the criminal case. The scene at the Basmany court on the day of their release was chaotic and high-strung, as dozens of television cameras crowded the area. Because the courthouse lacked private and discreet hallways for the accused to walk through, the sisters were led one by one through a long corridor that was hot and stuffy. Court bailiffs had to roughly clear space through the throngs of journalists, at one point even using a German shepherd to manage the crowd, an officer infamously shouting at the public, quote, everyone to the wall, clear the passage. To the wall, I said. The dog is very nervous, and I won't repeat it a second time. Amidst this tension, the sister's brother, Sergei, was seen arguing with journalists, at one point threatening a reporter who referred to his youngest sister, Maria, as insane. As you can probably imagine, the reaction from Mikhail's side of the family to the sisters' release was one of outrage and immediate legal opposition. The lawyer of Mikhail's sister Naira and her husband Genedik, who, as we know, had been officially recognized as a victim, quickly filed a complaint against the girls' release. The lawyer noted that the girls should be isolated from society. The public's reaction, however, was largely supportive of the sisters, fueled by a national debate over domestic violence. Support also came from high-profile figures such as musician Serge Tankian, who stepped up for the sisters, and journalist Ksenia Sobchak. On the 18th of October 2018, the Moscow City Court held an appellate hearing for the sisters. This hearing was essentially a high-level review of the restrictive rules placed on the sisters after they were released from jail in late September. The proceedings were held behind closed doors, meaning that the public and the media were not allowed to watch as the arguments happened. One of the most significant outcomes of this hearing was that the court decided to satisfy the defense appeal. This meant that judges agreed to relax some of the strict rules that had previously cut the girls off from almost anyone that they knew. Following the ruling by Moscow City Court Press Secretary Yuliana Solopova, the sisters were finally permitted to talk to anyone unrelated to their case. This included a wide circle of people who could offer them emotional support, such as, quote, friends, teachers, and relatives not involved in the case. However, the court was very careful to keep certain rules in place. Even though they could talk to friends about personal and everyday topics, the sisters were still, quote, prohibited from discussing the circumstances of the criminal case with these citizens. The court also maintained the strict rule that they were not allowed to give comments to the media. Most difficult of all for the family was that the sisters remained prohibited from communicating with each other without the direct permission of the investigator. They were also forbidden from speaking to participants in the criminal proceedings, which included the victims, which was their father's relatives, and any witnesses. The hearing also served as what can only be described as a battlefield between the sisters' defense team and Mikhail's surviving relatives, specifically Mikhail's sister and Genedik. They were deeply unhappy with the fact that the girls had been released from pretrial detention in the first place. These relatives asked the court to, quote, return the girls to custody, arguing that they were a danger to society. The Moscow City Court, however, rejected these complaints, choosing to uphold their earlier decision to keep the sisters out of jail while the investigation continued. Due to the fact that they lost their arguments at this hearing, Mikhail's sister Anne Genedict announced their intention to go to the Supreme Court of Russia to try once again to have the sisters' release overturned. For the sisters, the hearing on the 18th of October provided a small but vital increase in their personal freedom during a time when their lives were in legal limbo. By allowing them to reconnect with their teachers and friends, the court recognised that the girls were victims of brutal violence who needed a support system, even as they remained under the shadow of a charge for murder. One of the sisters had already stated in an interview that prison is better than living with their father, and that this hearing ensured that their new life, though still restricted, would be slightly less like the prison they had endured at home. Following that hearing, the sisters faced years of legal battles, and it wasn't long before they were facing yet another crisis. In January of 2019, the sisters' grandmother filed a civil lawsuit to kick the eldest sister, Christina, out of the apartment where the family had lived. Since the grandmother had owned the home, she did have the legal power to remove people from the registration. And this actually hadn't been the first time that she'd done this. She had previously used these same legal steps to evict the sisters' mother Aurelia and their older brother Sergei. On the 25th of February 2019, the Butrisky Court of Moscow sided with the grandmother and ordered that Christina be, quote, discharged from the apartment. This left the sisters in a very difficult financial position, and they had to take low-paying jobs in order to survive. In one instance, Christina had to leave a job at a supermarket because customers recognized her from the news and they started harassing her. By June of 2019, the investigative committee of the Russian Federation had reached the formal conclusion of its initial inquiry into the case. On the 14th of June, the girls were served with the final version of the criminal charges, which was a devastating moment for their legal defense. The authorities officially charged Christina, Angelina, and Maria with, quote, murder committed by a group of persons by prior conspiracy. This specific classification is incredibly severe, carrying a potential sentence of 8 to 20 years in prison, or even a life sentence. The investigation had reached this conclusion based upon the theory that the sisters had, quote, planned the attack on their father in advance and divided the roles between themselves. According to the official narrative from the district level, Christina was assigned to use the pepper spray to, quote, disorient him in space and make it impossible to resist, while the two younger sisters were to use a knife and a hammer to kill him while he slept. However, the findings of the investigation itself were strangely contradictory. The investigators openly admitted in the final indictment that the girls' actions were, quote, the result of illegal violent actions on part of the father. Despite this admission, the state refused to lower the charge to a less serious offence. The legal team representing the sisters was described as being completely perplexed by this outcome. They argued that the state was ignoring its own evidence, which proves that Mikhail had systematically used physical and sexual violence against his daughters for several years. Quote, the fact that the girls' actions were provoked by the actions of the victim himself has been established by the investigation and confirmed by examinations. They further emphasised that the sisters committed the act, quote, in response to systemic moral and physical violence from their father, including sexual violence. In an attempt to fight these severe charges, the lawyers filed formal complaints with the head of the investigative committee, Alexander Bastraikin. They insisted that the girls were, quote, victims of brutal violence and cynical impunity who had no choice but to act to save their own lives. The defense emphasized that the girls lived in constant conditions of relative isolation, where they were sure of the impossibility of receiving outside help, which made the situation hopeless. They argued that the sisters were not criminals, but were simply trying to stop the inevitable, terrible crimes that were being committed against them. While the investigation had revealed mental disorders for all three girls resulting from their father's cruelty, these findings were not enough to stop the state from pushing for the heavy murder conviction. This decision by the investigators to push for the most serious charge possible ignored the long-term traumatic situation that the girls had endured and sparked a massive public outcry across the nation. This decision was viewed by many as a systemic betrayal of domestic violence victims, and it was the moment that transformed a private family tragedy into a national national movement for legal reform and human rights. Due to the fact that Russian law requires prior government approval for group demonstrations, activists organized, quote, individual pickets outside the investigative committee building on Arbat Street in Moscow starting on the 19th of June 2019. This form of protest involves a single person holding a sign while others wait in a long line to take their turn, effectively demonstrating large numbers without violating assembly laws. Activist Darya Sarenko, who helped coordinate the instructions for the line, explained the gravity of the situation by stating, quote, if we look away from the topic of domestic violence, we shouldn't be surprised that in a country where husbands beat and rape their wives, police plant drugs on journalists. This statement made by Darya refers to the high-profile criminal case of Ivan Gulanov, who is an investigative journalist for the news outlet Meduza. In early June of 2019, just weeks before the sisters were hit with the final murder charges, Gulanov was arrested by Moscow police on what were widely considered to be fabricated drug dealing charges. The public reaction to his arrest was massive and immediate, as citizens believed the police had, quote, planted drugs on him as a way to punish him for reporting on government corruption. According to the sources, Darya Sarenko's quote highlights her belief that the state's failure to protect victims of domestic violence is deeply connected to its willingness to use law enforcement as a tool for political repression. The atmosphere at the individual pickets had been one of somber determination, with about 200 people participating on the first day alone. Participants came from all walks of life, including an engineer named Yekaterina, who stood in line for over an hour and shared her own survival story, saying, quote, even for an adult, it's very difficult to fight back against domestic abuse. You really feel like you're trapped. You can't evaluate the situation objectively. To ensure as many people as possible could participate, picketers eventually limited their turns to just 30 seconds each. The protests were defined by powerful visual messaging and slogans that resonated across social media. The most prominent sign read, "The sisters need rehabilitation, not prison." Another common sign declared, we are the sisters, a phrase adopted from other high-profile human rights cases to show that any citizen could find themselves in the sisters' position of the state failing to protect them. Other posters carried the message, self-defense from a domestic tyrant is not a crime. Simultaneously, a digital flash mob titled I Didn't Want to Die was launched by influencers and bloggers, garnering support from millions of followers. This campaign highlighted the impossible choice faced by victims, quote, dying at home at the hands of their abusers or defending themselves and ending up in prison. Anna Ravina, director of the Naisu.net Center, noted that the case showed the harsh reality of Russian life. Quote, for years they lived in terror, in hell. Thinking why didn't they just leave is superficial. It shows the degree to which people don't understand what happens when your self-esteem is destroyed. The tangible result of this public pressure was visible in a massive petition on change.org that was addressed to the investigative committee. By June of 2019, the petition had garnered more than 115,000 signatures, a number that quickly grew to over 130,000. Alyona Popova, a human rights activist and petition founder, argued that if the sisters were convicted, quote, anyone who defends themselves could face the same fate. The protests were not just about the three sisters. They were a demand for structural change in Russian law. Organizers sought the adoption of a formal law against domestic violence and the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, an international agreement to protect women from family violence. Legal experts such as Alina Solovyova suggested that the case could lead to the vital, quote, reconsideration of the concept of necessary self-defense to include victims of ongoing long-term crimes. However, the movement faced hostility from conservative groups and from Mikhail's relatives. Mikhail's nephew, Arsen, and members of the, quote, male state organization organized counter-protests where they labeled the sisters as, quote, cold-blooded killers and, quote, sluts. These groups claimed that the accusations of abuse were simply provocations and fiction for protection. Despite this opposition, public sentiment leaned towards the sisters. A 2019 survey by the Levada Center revealed that 47% of Russian women and 33% of men believed the sisters' actions were justified. In early 2020, the case became stuck in a conflict between different parts within the Russian government, often described by legal experts as a game of administrative ping-pong. This conflict pitted the investigative committee of the Russian Federation against the Prosecutor General's office, leaving the three sisters in a state of legal limbo, while two agencies fundamental to the Russian justice system fought over the very definition of their actions. The administrative tug-of-war began in earnest when the Prosecutor General's office made a landmark decision that initially seemed to signal the end of the sisters' legal nightmare. Deputy Prosecutor General Viktor Grin formally refused to sign the indictment for murder, stating that the investigators had provided a, quote, incorrect classification for the sisters' actions. Instead, he ordered that the charges be reclassified as, quote, necessary self-defense. The Prosecutor General's office reached this conclusion after a meticulous review of the evidence, which they described as showing that the girls had been subjected to, quote, beating, constant humiliation, threats and abuse, physical and sexual violence. The office argued that the sisters had developed a defensive reaction within this environment, which made them protect themselves by any means. Legally, this decision was supported by a plenary order from the Supreme Court, which clarified that, quote, necessary self-defense may be extended over a period of time. The logic was that if a victim, quote, senses that their life and health are in danger, they do not have to wait for the exact specific moment when they are attacked to respond, especially in cases of ongoing domestic captivity. Lawyer Alexei Parshin noted that if this reclassification had been accepted, it would have, quote, essentially meant the end of a criminal investigation against the sisters. Despite the order from the nation's top prosecutors, the investigative committee, the agency responsible for the initial inquiry, refused to back down. This agency, led by Alexander Bastryskin, stood firmly in its original charge of, quote, murder committed by a group following a premeditated conspiracy. The investigative committee argued that the sisters had a concrete plan and that their actions did not fit the traditional definition of immediate self-defense. When the investigators filed a formal complaint against the reclassification order, then Prosecutor General Yuri Shaika personally rejected their complaint and, quote, insisted on the order, calling for even more psychological and psychiatric evaluations to be conducted on the sisters. This created a complicated situation where the state's investigators could not move the case to trial because they lacked the prosecutorial support required by law. Lawyer Alexei Liptser described this phase as ping-ponging back and forth, as the case file was repeatedly sent between agencies, with neither side willing to yield. The investigative committee appeared determined to validate the year and a half they had spent building a murder case under Article 105, while the Prosecutor General's office initially focused on the long-term traumatic situation of the defendants. This delay was further complicated by the appointment of a new Prosecutor General, Igor Krasnov, who had previously been a high-ranking official within the investigative committee. Defense attorneys expressed some concerns that this change in leadership might lead the Prosecutor General's office to realign with the investigative committee's more punitive stance. In a turn of events that stunned the sisters and their legal teams, the Prosecutor General's office eventually performed a complete U-turn. In July of 2020, Deputy Prosecutor General Victor Grin, the very same official who had previously championed the self-defense reclassification, officially approved the indictment for premeditated murder. No clear explanation was provided as for why the office suddenly reversed its position, and lawyer Alexei Liptser noted with some irony that, quote, obviously he has changed his position during this time, while lawyer Mary Daftayan suggested that the reversal was part of a, quote, wider trend of dismissing human rights that coincided with major constitutional changes within Russia that summer. By the end of this administrative struggle, the sisters were left facing the same severe charges they had originally been served in 2018, carrying a potential sentence of up to 20 years. But all was not lost for the sisters, as there was still the posthumous trial of Mikhail to take place. This posthumous trial of Mikhail was a rare and legally complex procedure that fundamentally altered the course of the murder case against the daughters. In many legal systems, a criminal case ends when the suspect dies, but the Russian system allows for, quote, posthumous investigation if relatives insist on clearing the person's name. This process began in earnest on the 4th of December 2020, when the Basmany courts in Moscow ruled that the state's previous refusal to launch a criminal case against the dead father was illegal. By March of 2021, the three sisters were officially recognised as victims in this new criminal case launched against their late parents. The initial charges brought against them were for sexual assault, sexual coercion, and torture. As the investigation into Mikhail's actions progressed, experts conducted a comprehensive forensic, psychological, sexological, psychiatric examination to understand his behaviour. The results, released in late 2021, were described in the media as explosive. This forensic study concluded that Mikhail had a, quote, sexual attraction disorder of a paedophilic nature. The report detailed how he had manipulated his family and those around him using, quote, threats, demonstrations of violence, cruelty, insults, and humiliation. Expert evidence confirms that he used beatings, bullying, physical and sexual violence against his daughters. Furthermore, the investigation established that Mikhail had been involved in the distribution of pornographic material that involved his daughters. These findings supported the sisters' long-held testimony that he was a effectively holding them hostage in their home. Forensic expert Eduard Tumanov noted that Mikhail had, quote, raised his daughters in order to use them. The posthumous case reached a major milestone when it was formally registered at the Butchersky Court in Moscow on the 30th of March 2023. Mikhail was tried on several severe counts, including, quote, violent sexual acts against minors, intentional causing of serious bodily harm to several persons, as well as the production and distribution of pornography. Because the case involved detailed evidence of sexual abuse against the girls, the trial was held behind closed doors. During the trial, the state prosecution called approximately 30 witnesses to testify about Mikhail's behavior and the family's, quote, slave-like existence. The hearings were extensive, filling about 40 volumes of legal materials. Throughout this time, the sisters' defense team remained, quote, convinced that the court will confirm their version of actions in conditions of necessary defense. Lawyer Alexei Parshin emphasized that it was vital for every detail to be established so that there would be, quote, no doubts about their acquittal, either in court or in society. And after years of legal maneuvering, the court reached its landmark decision on the 21st of April 2025. Mikhail was posthumously found guilty on all counts, and subsequently he received the death penalty. This verdict proved that the father was a predator who had subjected his daughters to years of horrific physical and sexual abuse. Lawyers for the sisters argue that this verdict provided the additional and irrefutable evidence needed to show the girls acted out of necessary self-defense. While the investigation against Christina, Angelina, and Maria was technically still ongoing at the time of the verdict, it was widely expected that all murder charges against them would finally be dropped. This landmark decision was seen as more than just a legal victory. It was a symbolic turning point for Russia, where domestic violence is often condoned or ignored by authorities. As activist Anna Ravina noted, the case held symbolic meaning for the entire country, showing that the legal system could eventually recognize the rights of victims to defend their own lives. Now, as of the publishing of this video, the criminal charges against Christina, Angelina, and Maria had not been officially dropped, but their legal exoneration is widely expected. And while the investigation into the sisters is still technically considered to be active, the legal foundation for the murder case against them has been fundamentally dismantled by the state's own judicial findings. Although they are still technically suspects, the sisters finally have a chance to start a normal life. For millions of women in Russia and Russian-occupied territories, the verdict offers a rare sense of hope that the prevailing mentality can be changed. The sister's mother, Orila Dunduk, stated that her daughters were moved and stunned to tears by the compassion shown by strangers, as their father had spent their life teaching them that no one would care about them and no one would believe them. And as of now, that is all I have for you in this case. It's a case clouded by complex political and societal arguments, but at the very core of it, 3 young women, ignored by the people who were supposed to protect them, took matters into their own hands. And all I can ask of you is, can you really blame them? Let me know what you think of this case in the comments down below. If there are any further updates, I'll pop them in the pinned comments. Thank you so much for watching this true crime video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you can be notified every single time I post a brand new true crime video. I also stream co-working streams over on my Twitch from around 9 AM UK time to 5 PM UK time, Monday to Friday, every working week. So if you work from home or are studying or just need some company or just want to talk to me about true crime or see what I do and how I make videos, then come and join me. It's completely free and you can find a link in the description and in the pinned comments. With all that being said, I'll see you in the next case.